to hear that notification. There we go. All right. Well, good afternoon or good morning, good evening even, depending on where you may be joining from today. Welcome to Team-Based Subject Liaisons, a model for research engagement, brought to you by the ACRL University Library Section's Professional Development Committee. We're so delighted to have all of you, and especially our presenters, with us today, who I'll introduce in just a couple minutes. I'm Laura Garapi. I'm one of the co-chairs of the committee, and I'll be introducing and closing out this program along with support from my fellow committee members, Amber Wessies and Anna Sandelli, who are both here today. And this is one of an ongoing series of online programs sponsored by our committee. And I'll actually just drop in chat a quick rundown of all of the presentations we've offered in the past and those coming up in the future. It is updated regularly, so please keep your eyes peeled for more opportunities. Before we begin today's presentation, just a few quick logistics. Many of you may have heard Lois from ACRL cover this as you entered the room, but just want to hit those again for those who may be joining now. So the session is being recorded, and we'll send the link of the video, slides, and any other supplemental documentation that our presenters may choose to include to everyone who registered for the program. This will be an hour total, including time for questions. So we'll make sure you get on your way to your 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock or whatever time zone time you may be in. So throughout the presentation, please do feel free to add questions into the chat box at any time. My fellow committee member, Amber, will be collating those questions. She'll make every effort to acknowledge that she's received yours as you submit it. And then we'll be prepared to read them to you when we have breaks for questions and or at the end of the presentation as well. And of course, our presenters will answer. As you use the chat feature today, just a general reminder to set it to direct chats to everyone. Zoom likes to default to hosts and panelists. So that everyone joining us today can enjoy the dialogue, please do change that when you send the chats in. Lois also mentioned that we're using Zoom's auto caption feature during this presentation. If you want to activate it or deactivate it, you should just be able to click the More option at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you'll see some options there for you. Finally, at the very end, we'll drop a link to a brief evaluation. We hope you'll take the time to fill that out so we can get your feedback on today's program. With all that out of the way, lots of housekeeping. I'm very happy to start today's program. So I'll very briefly introduce our presenters, and then they can more fully introduce themselves as they see fit. Honora Eskridge is the director of the Stevenson Science and Engineering Library at Vanderbilt University, where she leads library services to science and engineering disciplines. And she speaks and writes on library management, service models, and information literacy for engineers. And Alex Carroll is the librarian for STEM research at the Vanderbilt University Libraries, where he supports the research of faculty and develops curriculum integrated info literacy instruction programs for students in the sciences. So without further delay, thank you again so much, Alex and Honora, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Laura. It's nice to virtually see everyone. Thank you so much for coming. So here's what we're going to cover today in our hour together. First, Alex and I are going to go over some of the existing service models that you see typically in academic libraries to support teaching and research. And we're going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses associated with those models. Then we're going to get into our team-based model. We'll talk about how it works. We'll talk about the benefits. We feel that it resolves a lot of the issues that exist in other service models. There are some costs, and we will go over those as well. And then we're even going to talk about kind of a day in the life, what day to day it feels like to work on a liaison team. And we'll go through some steps to transition to a team. And then we plan to have lots of time at the end to answer lots of questions and have some good discussion.
So anytime we're talking about something that a lot of us have a strong formed professional identity about, like liaison roles, discussions on kind of what those roles are and what they should look like and what tasks they should do can often be provocative and even emotional. So what we want to do is we want to encourage you to approach today's topic with the mutual learning approach, right? Which acknowledges that each of us is missing information, right? Each of us have imperfect information. We're reflecting kind of the experiences and the expertise we have. And, we may encounter over the course of today, you may encounter kind of differences with what your experiences are, right? Or differences with your preconceived notions of what being a liaison is. And so we would encourage you to embrace those differences and embrace those as opportunities for learning, because that's the spirit that we're going to enter today's talking to.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the existing service models that one sees in most libraries today. And what Alex and I find is that typically you see one of three things. First, you might see the subject specialist model. This is one where you have librarians who have academic training in a particular discipline, and they are hired to work with the faculty and students and support teaching and research in that same discipline, or perhaps in related disciplines. The second model that we often see is the functional specialist model. This person is not hired for an academic background that they have, but more so for skills, a skill set. Perhaps they can program in Python, or they know how to use geographic information systems, something like that, right? And their job is to support teaching and research anywhere in the university where that skill is needed. And then thirdly, the thing we probably see most often is the combination, right? We see the subject specialist model and the functional specialist model kind of living side by side. So let's dig in a little deeper and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each of these models. With the subject model, you have the librarian oftentimes with, again, a specific academic background, liaising with a department or a set of departments. And this is an approach I think we're all familiar with. It's been around a long time. It has its roots back in the old subject bibliographer role, which many of us might remember. And the major benefit of the subject model from the faculty's point of view is having a personal librarian, right? Having someone they know, someone who knows them. But the subject librarian model is also beneficial for the libraries and from the library's perspective. Ideally, this person's academic training means that they can speak the same language as the faculty and design services, right, that are suited to their needs. More importantly, though, they can build relationships. And we think that the existence of the subject model is sort of a tacit statement by library administrators that relationships are important, even critical to library success. The subject specialist model, when it's working well, can achieve strategic partnerships for the library. Now, that said, we can't blame our administrators when from time to time they say to us, okay, subject specialists, I need support for a new initiative, or I need people to attend an event. Where are those relationships you've been cultivating, right? Bring me some faculty. And I think we've probably all received those requests at different times. And I think we all know that those requests don't always yield the results that our administrators might hope for, right? They don't always reap the rewards of their investment. And that's one of the concerns about the subject model, right? It's a lot of FTE. These are some screenshots of our subject page, subject specialist page at Vanderbilt. And I will tell you that you have to scroll 3 times to get to the bottom of the page. And that's with all of us covering multiple disciplines. In most organizations, the subject model can involve quite a few people, right? It's a significant investment in terms of personnel. And I think we all know that the return on that investment that our administrators see is at best uneven. The other issue with the subject model has to do with what Alex and I like to call the myth of subject expertise. Those of us who are subject specialists know that it's impossible to be an expert in all the disciplines we serve. Even if you have academic training in a discipline, you're not going to have expertise in every subject taught in that discipline or in every area of research that your faculty are pursuing in that discipline. And the truth is, it's not really even necessary in order to be a good liaison, right? We don't need content mastery. Our faculty have that. What we librarians bring to the table is process mastery, right? We know the process skills that students need to be successful in their programs. And that might include, you know, how to articulate a problem or how to develop a hypothesis. It might involve, you know, visualizing data or good old-fashioned information skills, the ability to find information and analyze it and interpret it and communicate it, right? That's what matters. The academic background can help in some ways. We think it can open some doors. But in terms of the service model, this notion of expertise in some ways can do more harm than good. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment.
So we'll put a pin in this kind of idea of content mastery and focus a little bit more on this process mastery idea, right? Because I think in a real significant way, the functional model is really a response to this kind of recognition of the value of process expertise, right? And it's a recognition that these kinds of process skills can be really, really valuable. It's valuable expertise that librarians have. And so the functional model, I think, in libraries that have embraced it, leans all the way into this idea. And it says that, you know, process expertise are so important that this is what we should build our positions around. So in a library that has adopted the functional model, instead of, say, hiring a science librarian or a humanities librarian or a social sciences librarian, instead you end up hiring a data management librarian or a digital humanities librarian or a copyright and publishing librarian, right? And I think in some ways, right, if you're a librarian, what can be exciting about the functional model is that it is in some ways an acknowledgement of the scope creep problem that I think can pop up with the subject specialist model. The idea that if you're a subject specialist, seemingly you're supposed to master every functional expertise under the sun, and new ones seem to pop up every year that you need to get a grip on, right? So that's maybe exciting. But I think at many institutions, right, for administrators who are bringing in this new idea, this new model, there's some unstated expectations about what's going to come along with this model. I think for a lot of library administrators, there's an expectation that librarians with a process expertise are going to get more engaged in highly visible kind of faculty research projects. So that data management librarian is going to be involved on those NSF funded projects that have a DMP requirement, or that digital humanities librarian is going to be involved on that new National Endowment of the Humanities project that brought in a lot of grant funding as well. I think there's also a sense for administrators, right, that these skills are so valuable that they're going to cut across disciplines, right? So there's no need to kind of bound these positions within a subject area, right? You're not going to be the data management librarian for sciences. You're just going to do it for everyone, right? And same thing for publishing or scholarly communication or what have you. But I think there's also unstated expectations then for the people entering into these roles, right? I think there's an expectation that these skills are going to be so valuable that opportunities are just going to be all over the place. And whoever steps into these roles is going to immediately find super rich, meaningful projects to work on that are going to create these kinds of relationships that we mentioned administrators want to see. But I think if you talk to a lot of library administrators, and especially if you talk to people that are occupying functional specialist roles, there's a sense that this isn't necessarily happening all the time, right? And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. But one of the reasons Honora and I really come back to a lot is that a real challenge with the functional model is that it goes against the grain of how most universities are actually organized, what their organizational design looks like. And while we know every research university is idiosyncratic and they're all dynamic and they're constantly changing, and every new provost brings in a new strategic initiative that has new kind of strategic departments or whatever, at their core, right, research universities are fairly hierarchical and they tend to be based around colleges and departments, right? And I think these colleges and departments, right, at their core are the primary units of the organization, right? This is how our institutions are built, right, is around colleges and departments. So one real key advantage that the subject model has over the functional model is that you can target these areas and start to build strategic relationships with your assigned areas, right? So not only do you know that there's a dean for that school that you can work with, or department chairs that you can work with, but there are also directors of graduate studies or directors of undergraduate studies, or even principal lecturers or new tenure track faculty. There's real targeted relationships that you can look out and go out and build those relationships around. However, for a functional specialist, right, these kinds of obvious stakeholders that you can tap into, I think it's a little less key, right? There's not necessarily this intuitive roadmap that you should be targeting these specific people, right? And there's also an additional concern if you're at a kind of institution that uses this combo role that Honora mentioned earlier, where you have both subject specialists and functional specialists, you start to have concerns about, stepping on toes, right? Maybe you're wondering, I want to go talk to that English librarian about that, or that English faculty member about this digital humanities project, but do I need to ask the English librarian's permission first? Do I need to include them on the email? Do I need to invite them on the project? Or even, is there some kind of baggage or history with this faculty member that I'm not aware of that I really should before I go to talk to them, right? All of these things are kind of headwinds that get in the way of kind of building these real relationships, right? And I think for a lot of functional specialists that feel like they can't build these relationships, they still feel a pressure to feel like they're delivering output, right? Because we all feel that way, right? We want to feel like we're contributing. And so a lot of them kind of end up spinning up kind of what looks a lot like kind of drop-in workshops or one-off workshops, right? And I think this workshop model, again, kind of has very uneven success, right? And for a lot of different factors, but I think too, you see a lot are kind of uneven attendance, right? So you get one workshop that just it resonates like crazy and it's standing room only and you don't even have enough computers to have everyone install the Python package versus another one where there's only 2 people that show up, right? And then another concern about these workshops, right, is how do you evaluate them, right? If you're only seeing this person one time, how do you track what they actually applied from what they learned, right? Versus, right, with the subject specialists, right, they have the real advantage that if you want to put data visualization as a subject specialist, you can integrate it into the curriculum, right? And if you're integrating things into the curriculum, that means you can meet every student, you're there in their learning space. And so, you know, there are real learning objects you can look at, right? You can look at their homework assignments and you can look at their research assignments. And, you know, we could talk on and on about the advantages of curriculum integration, but for the purposes of this talk, what we think is important about curriculum integration is that it also creates a positive feedback loop in terms of building relationships, right? When you're teaching that class in a curriculum integrated setting, there's a faculty member in that class too, right? And you're building a relationship every time you deliver a class for them, right? And not just individual faculty members, but when you have, say, an annual meeting with a department chair or with the dean, you have tangible classes you can point to, and they can start to see that, wow, the library is really on our team, right? We're actually getting something for all of that overhead that comes out of our grant funding. We're really getting people that are on our team. So there are some real kind of advantages that the subject model has potentially over the functional model. And now Honora is going to talk a little bit about what some common concerns are between both.
So in addition to the issues we've just outlined, one big concern that applies to both the functional and the subject model, and this is probably the biggest issue of all, has to do with this problem of working in a siloed environment, right? Both models set you up to be working very much in isolation. And it can be problematic both for the librarian, the individual contributor, and also for the manager. If you are working in a silo, it is inevitable that your personal preferences, your personal style starts to dictate or define the service model, the services you deliver to the departments you work with. Likewise, you may find yourself allowing the style or culture of the departments you work with to dictate or define the service model. Now, if you're a manager and you have, say, 8 librarians working in 8 silos, guess what you end up with, or you can end up with 8 service models, right? And that is no way to design and deliver and manage a service portfolio. You end up with very, very disjointed services. And remember back a few minutes ago when I said that the myth of subject expertise can sometimes do a little more harm than good? Well, here's a great example of some of the baggage that gets attached to that. The idea that since you're an expert, you should know what you're doing. You can figure it all out on your own. Who can work that way? I don't know anybody who can work that way without making mistakes at some point, right? But that's how it gets interpreted anyway. And if you're the manager, it's really difficult to ask questions, to give guidance, to insert yourself. Because what will happen is the answer you're going to get back when you make an inquiry, and maybe not explicitly, but what you basically hear is, well, I'm an expert. I know my area, right? I know my faculty. You don't. And so managers feel like they can't insert themselves in a way that they might otherwise. Another issue with working alone has to do with accountability. When you work alone, you decide what the definition of success looks like. So in addition to having multiple service models, you can end up with multiple definitions of success, or maybe even no definition of success. From the manager's perspective, this is going to mean that you're going to have high and low performers, or people who are perceived that way. And that might just seem like a normal part of working life, but let me just tell you right now, it doesn't have to be that way, and nobody should settle for that. And it could all just be because there's no standard definition of what success is, or it could be those departmental cultures influencing the service models. And lastly, with all these different service models in play, it's likely that many of them are not tied to the libraries or the institution's vision or goals. And of course, they need to be. So we believe that silos can really get in the way of both the individuals and the organization's success.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about kind of the subject and the functional specialist models and kind of the combo roles and some shared features of both. So we want to get a chance to kind of learn where you're coming to this from. So we're going to drop our first poll of the day in, and this is going to ask you to describe which of these best describes the liaison model at your institution. Is it the subject specialist, the functional specialist, or a combo? And let's see what you have to say. We'll wait for a little bit while you get a chance to answer here.
Yep, and I'm keeping an eye on the percentage. We're up to about 80%. Give another few seconds for folks to chime in. Okay. Almost at 90. I think it's okay with you, Alex.
Yep, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yep.
And share the results.
Okay, so I don't think this is a surprise to us, right? We see kind of a clear majority for combo. The second is of 65% of combo. About a third of you are at pure subject specialist shops, and 4% of you are at a totally functional specialist. So yes, we have seen some institutions go that route, 100% functional specialists. So cool. All right, so a nice kind of mix and kind of what we might have expected to see. All right, so Honora, why don't you tell our attendees a little bit about what the team model actually looks like?
Yeah, let's talk about the team model. So I think you'll see that this is fairly straightforward. It is at heart a subject model because we're subject specialists after all. But instead of having a very specific subject specialty or specialties, we have backed out of the weeds a bit to have a broader subject specialty. So instead of being the librarian for mathematics and computer science, you might be a librarian for STEM. Instead of being a librarian for finance, you might be a business librarian or a management librarian. And your teammates would be doing the same thing, right? Instead of each librarian having specific departments that are assigned to them that they own, the whole team will share all the departments together, all right? And what this allows us to do is to create a shared vision and strategy, and it addresses the reality of what subject specialists do and what we're capable of doing, which is working with multiple disciplines, right? Because of those process skills. The team coordinates and collaborates on all the major work areas. So instruction, reference, collections, research support, whatever it is. They have a shared outreach strategy, and they build faculty relationships together. And this way, the relational capital that's so important is shared. And less experienced teammates have the opportunity to learn how to build a relationship, right? Which is one of those things that you don't learn, that no one teaches you, and it can be very hard to figure that out on your own. So you're not only building up the social relational capital, you're actually building the capacity to keep building social and relational capital, right? Within that department. So that it makes it all much more sustainable. Leadership is also shared among the team members. Everyone has the opportunity to lead in one of the major work areas. So one person might coordinate instruction, another person might coordinate collections. And those functional specialist type skills, what's going to happen there is the librarians are going to learn them. We're going to determine what skills we need or our users need us to develop so we can support their teaching and research. And then we're going to build up those skills within our team, with the goal being that everyone has skills in those areas. That's the goal, is like a sort of an even distribution of those skill sets.
So that's the big picture. So what does this look like actually in practice? What does a day as a team-based liaison look like? So one of the ways we often start our days is having a team huddle, right? And I think, back in the day, in 2019, these team huddles always would have been in person around a conference table. Starting in, first quarter of 2020, these became entirely virtual, and now increasingly they're blended, right? Where there's a mix of us in person, a mix of us on Zoom or Teams or something. And what we do in these meetings is we kind of get together and make sure that we are aware of what our priorities for the week are, right? So we maybe check in and say, these are deadlines coming up, here are classes that are happening, here are meetings that are happening, who is going to do these, right? And making sure that everyone is on the page with who's doing what this week, and kind of keeping sure that that we're on track with what we wanted to accomplish this semester or this year or whatever, right? After these kind of team huddles, what might happen, right, is two librarians might break off and go collaboratively build a lesson together, right? Maybe this is a class that they're doing for the first time that they're building from scratch together, or maybe this is a class that one person taught previously the last 3 semesters and they're getting ready to hand it over to their teammate, right? And so maybe they're going through and they're making sure these learning outcomes still make sense, these activities still kind of lead us to these learning outcomes, and maybe they're also just making sure that that database isn't actually turned off today for whatever reason, right? But it could be, right, that as this collaborative lesson, you're getting ready to go walk over to the lecture hall together. One of these liaisons gets the dreaded phone call, right, that your kid is sick and needs to get picked up, or it's 2022, right? So maybe your kid isn't sick, but one of their classmates is sick, and so your kid still needs to be picked up, right? In a traditional kind of solo model, right, this would require you to try to frantically call the faculty member's office and tell them that you can't come, or you're shooting them an email, or you're even running to the lecture hall just to tell them you can't teach the class, right? And then maybe you're going to be able to find another time to get back in. But with a team model, right, you have an experienced backup, right, who has maybe taught the class before or has built the class with you, who can step in and, not just teach the class, but teach the class well, right? And to keep building up that relationship with the faculty member. And this might sound hypothetical, but I can assure you that I have been the parent getting that 10:30 call on our team before. And our colleague, say Josh, who isn't here today, has stepped in many, many times over the last 2 years to teach a class for me in this scenario. So these are examples, right, of how you kind of work side by side in a team, right? You're building things, you're doing things together. But that's not necessarily the case all the time, or even most of the time, right? A lot of what you're doing in a team is still working independently, but you are working independently on initiatives that advance your shared vision and your shared values, right? So in the same day in the team, right, in the afternoon, you might have one librarian who's working on our renewal notices, right? Who's looking through at what serials are coming due and is taking a look at the cost per use on some of the low value potential journals and wondering, maybe we should swap these out for some of these journals we don't subscribe to, but that have high turn-away data, right? They don't necessarily have to make this decision for themselves. They might just collate this data, and then we can talk about it at our next team meeting to decide what we want to do going forward together. Well, that librarian's working on some collections work. Another member of the team might be off meeting with a research group, right? They might be attending a PhD or a graduate student's prelim defense as they're going up for candidacy, and they're participating in that process, right? When you're freed up for your colleagues to do collections, maybe you're doing some of this kind of outreach engagement type work. And meanwhile, yet another member of the team is maybe actually has some dedicated research and writing time, right? One of the great things about a team is that you've got a built-in network of co-authors and research collaborators to work on. And again, if your teammates are working on engagement and working on collections, maybe you can get an afternoon to actually dig into writing your portion of the next team paper. So that's what this kind of looks like in practice. Let's talk a little bit about what Honora and I see as the main benefits of the team model.
Yeah, so hopefully you're starting to see how this model breaks down a lot of the silos that we talked about earlier. So the big thing is shared strategy. That means that there's one service model, right? And everyone's bought into it. So everyone knows what the goal is. And that's going to result in more consistent services across departments and disciplines. Successes and challenges are shared by all, right? So everyone gets to work with that wonderful department that is just so easy to work with, right? And so interested in partnering with you. And everyone gets to work with that other department that hasn't been answering our emails lately, right? And together, actually, we have a better chance of having success with that other department than we would have on our own, right? On our own, we might just give up. Openness and accountability are going to raise everyone's game. And there are no more high and low performers. This is an amazing environment to learn in. Whether you are an experienced librarian like me, who has to keep up and has to keep learning new skills, right, to stay in the game, or whether you are brand new. We have a teammate who is fresh from library school, and this is a great environment to learn what it means to be an academic librarian, right? A lot of new librarians bring the skills. They have, they've got amazing tech skills, right? But to learn about this profession. So it's a great environment to learn in, no matter what stage of your career you're at. Everyone knows what your teammates do or what their teammates do. So if somebody moves on, there isn't such a big hole that, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, somebody leaves and there's just this tremendous chasm. The manager isn't left trying to figure out what that person's been doing the last 10 years and how we're going to cover their work, because everybody already knows their work. Everybody already knows what they do. And in fact, they've probably already done it. So it doesn't have the disruptive result that, that you'll often see when someone leaves. And all of this, believe it or not, makes the task of the manager much easier. It's easier to be a manager because all the essential duties of a manager, building a shared vision, making sure everyone's work is aligned, making sure people are productive, helping people to grow and learn and obtain the skills they need. It's all there. It's out in the open. It's actually baked in. So it's a lot easier to manage once everything is set up.
So those are the benefits. What are the costs of shifting to a team model, right? We think there are a lot of benefits, but we think there are some costs that are worth considering if this is something you're interested with your team, right? And while I don't think everyone's going to see these costs as net negative, some of these might feel like pretty radical departures from what you and some of your potential teammates might be used to. So one of the biggest changes about moving to the team model is that it's going to mean trading in some of that total autonomy that I think a lot of liaisons are accustomed to having, right? And in fact, this might be what appealed about the job of being a liaison librarian to begin with, right? The ability to kind of set your own priorities and define success for yourself, right? Again, being on a team doesn't mean giving up working independently, right? And in fact, the vast majority of your time, you'll still be working on things independently, right? But what it does mean is giving up latitude to decide for yourself what kind of really labor intensive and time intensive projects you want to take on, right? It means that before you make those commitments, considering your teammates, right? And considering the shared values and shared visions you have and thinking about, does this fit into what our vision is? Does this fit into our service model? And also, if I had to hand this initiative off to someone else in the team, could they do it, right? Would they want to do it? And in order to kind of make sure that you're staying aligned on those visions, part of what goes into the team model is also more communication and more meetings, I think, than what some of us are used to, right? In order to make sure that you are keeping aligned, right, you need to be talking, right? And for us, this means talking synchronously too, right? So for us, we typically have 2 synchronous meetings a week, one at the beginning and one at the end, one to set the table of what we want to accomplish for the week, and then another one to check in and see how it went, right? And then in between those 2 meetings, you can have kind of the asynchronous, Teams chat or email to kind of check in and share updates as things go along. But it's really important that you have these conversations to make sure that what you're doing is continuing to mesh with what you want to accomplish. And, to really kind of accomplish getting to this higher level, right, of accomplishing your goals, right, and to having real collaboration with your team, what this also means is that you really need to have real trust in your teammates. And I think we're defining trust here in a way that's a little different than what a lot of us are accustomed to when we think about trusting our colleagues here. We've talked a little bit about how being on a team involves handing things off from one another, right? And I think this is actually harder sometimes than it actually sounds in practice, right? If you've developed an initiative or if you've developed a relationship from scratch, right, it can feel scary to hand that over, right? This might be something you started all by yourself, right? You got it going. It might be with a faculty member who you adore, right? Maybe your personal friends, maybe your kids play together at the playground, right? It takes a lot, right, to hand that over to a teammate, right? You have to be willing to trust that they're going to honor that relationship and that project too. They're going to put just as much of themselves into it as you did, right? And to get to that point, right, of being willing to hand that over to someone else, well, it really requires being transparent, honest, and vulnerable with your teammates, right? It means letting them know what's important to you, right? Letting your teammates in. And, I think this can sound hokey, right? And this can sound kind of pie in the sky, but we can think about a practical example of this, right? If we're working on a class together and I'm getting ready to hand over a class that I've been teaching for a few years to one of my teammates, I'm handing over not just my lesson materials, right? But maybe I let them come observe me teach this class the first time, right? And it doesn't matter how long you've been doing this, right? Honora and I have been both doing this for a long time. Handing over your teaching materials, letting someone come in and see you in class, that starts to boil up those feelings of that kind of impostery thing. Like, oh man, this is the moment. They're all going to figure out that I'm not as good at this teaching thing as I've always been kind of leading them on to think, right? So for the team to really work, we need to be willing to acknowledge those feelings, right? And we need to be willing to move past the uncomfortable aspects of making ourselves vulnerable. And this also goes for learning new functional skills together, as Honora mentioned. To learn new things, we need to be willing to be honest with one another and say that, this is not something that is, I feel that I know how to do yet. So I need to learn this from you. I need to be led in this area. And it's going to require some real vulnerability to get to these to actually have a real team. So now we are going to pause for our second poll. We've talked about some of these potential costs, right? Some of these changes that moving to a team would entail. And we want to know which of these would seem most challenging to you. So again, I think we'll pause for a little bit and Laura will let us know kind of percentage-wise where we are in y'all's responses.
We're sitting at about 60% right now.
This one requires you got to deliberate on this one a little bit, right? This one's a little bit more of a judgment call.
We're almost up to 80. Maybe give another 5 to 10 seconds. Okay, we're at 83% and seems like it's slowed down a bit. Sound good, Alex, to go
Let's
ahead
do it.
and
Let's
play?
push it. Yep. Okay, a pretty good split this time. So a lot of you, a slight plurality of y'all say that more communication and more meetings is going to be challenging. 40% there. I think I expected that one to be at the top. Closely followed by loss of the autonomy at 37. Trusting your teammates at 30 and being vulnerable 21. So a lot of y'all feel comfortable being vulnerable. That's great, right? That's, I think, in some ways the biggest step here. Okay, so let's talk about what would be involved with transitioning to a team.
So if you wanted to move to a team-based model, one thing we want you to know is that it's not something that you have to do, it's not an all or nothing thing. It's not something you have to do suddenly and completely. You can actually do it incrementally. And on this slide, we've got a few steps and they actually kind of go from, just touching the surface, dipping your toe in to, fully, engaging with it. But the big thing and the place to start has to do with communication. So I know people just said that they don't love the idea of more meetings, and who does? But it's, it's essential, right? To building a team. So we need to build in a lot of communication. You may have a culture where that happens naturally, where people are already talking to each other, or you may have something on the opposite end of the spectrum. But no matter what, you need to create some structure. And it's probably going to be through meetings. If you're the manager, you want to be mindful of not just the the content of the meetings, the purpose of the meetings, but also sort of the process, sort of what's going on under the surface, right? Because you're trying to create a flow or a feel that's going to, build that team spirit, build that team culture. So if you're the manager, you want to try to keep an eye on both what's happening on the surface and what's happening under the surface. We would suggest 2 types of meetings: short weekly meetings to talk about how the bigger strategy is playing out day to day. Alex just mentioned our Monday morning huddles that we have. And then you're going to need some longer meetings where you work on vision and strategy. And you might want to do that 2 or 3 times a year. That strategy needs to be holistic, right? You need to look at all the departments that your team works with. Ideally, you'd want to do this in every area, collection, instruction, all the different areas you work in. But you could just start with one or part of one. You could start with undergraduate instruction, something like that. I do want to point out though, that when you start to do this, you need to bring down the silo walls a bit, right? You're going to have to. So, the English librarian needs to be invested in the success of the political science librarian, right? And vice versa. And to do that, the walls have to come down. The next few steps on here go a little bit deeper. Sharing information, creating common approaches and ways of doing things, and then actually going so far as to trade off relationships, trading off roles and tasks. If you're doing this, the walls are really coming down. And then the last bullet here is what you do if you want to formalize it. And that is, officially change job titles, perhaps change job descriptions. That's what we did a few years ago. We went from a siloed model to one where all of our librarians have the same title, librarian for STEM research. You heard it when Alex was introduced earlier, and they have identical job descriptions. So those are some steps to move to a team. And if there was one more step, I would probably just add repeat, right? You need to keep doing things over and over in order to build it in and to make it feel natural and normal.
So we just have a few closing remarks here before we transition to answering some of your questions that I've seen that they've been coming in. We're excited to look at those. We really want to say that Honora and I really believe in the liaison librarian model, right? This is what we spent our career doing. We think that this is an important role, and we think it is a critically important role for the institution to achieve those kinds of relationships, to develop that relational capital, to make sure that the library is integrated into the teaching mission and the research enterprise of our universities, right? We think the liaison model is essential. That being said, we really think that there are a lot of advantages to creating liaison positions that are built around subject areas, right? We talked about some of them, but aligning with the organizational design of the university is a real critical advantage. And I think it's one that shouldn't be understated when you're considering how to build these positions and how to formulate these positions. And then finally, we think that even really well-intentioned, motivated, passionate liaisons that are in positions, right, can experience uneven success when you're working alone, right? We've talked a lot about kind of the struggles that can happen when you're working alone. And so we think placing liaisons into teams is going to enable more consistent service models, more sustainable programming, and more meaningful professional development. So just a couple of resources that we'll mention here on our way out. If you want to learn more about our approach, we'd encourage you to take a look at some of the stuff we've written here. I'd point out especially the publication there at the end, the 2020 article that we wrote in Portal, when we reflect on this quite a bit from a STEM lens. And then some of these other publications are examples of what you can do when you're in a team, right? These are all kind of, you'll notice these are all grouped author papers. These are all projects that we were able to work on together because we're in a team, because we're able to identify initiatives, and because we're able to kind of think through them, formulate them, implement them, and then evaluate them all together. It's kind of remarkable what you can do across not just instruction or collection development, but research engagement as well. Kind of the whole kind of portfolio of what a subject specialist is expected to do. And then finally, a couple of things, right? There's a lot of great stuff out there about thinking about service models. We couldn't possibly list all the stuff that's influenced us here, but we did want to call out a handful of things that have really kind of stuck with us and really kind of influenced our thinking on this here. So we wanted to give these folks a shout out for helping us kind of formulate our thoughts in this space. So we will last leave you with a picture of our team doing some teamwork, doing some planning for what's left on the semester, and we're planning a couple of research studies here as well. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and we'll look forward to chatting with y'all or seeing what y'all have in the chat for us.
Yes, thank you so much, Alex and Honora. That was wonderful. And my compliments to your timing, which is quite precise and the targeted allotted time for questions. I'm going to hand off to Amber in just a moment to share some questions, but as all of you have probably gathered, presenters and participants, there has been extremely robust conversation and questions in the chat, and I don't think we're going to get through all of the questions we've received. We've also made an effort to group some of them and taken some liberties in combining some questions to try to give you as much time as possible. I don't want to speak for our presenters, but I imagine they'd be happy to share their contact information for any follow-ups we're not able to get to today. So with that said, Amber, would you like to take point on sharing out some of these questions to our presenters?
Hi, yes, let me get my camera going. I had to make my screen so small. Okay, there were definitely a lot of questions. So thank you, Honora and Alex, for sharing that with us. So we have grouped some of them so we can kind of walk through. But initially, one of the first questions that came in was, are you seeing an increasing cross-disciplinary research, teaching, and other initiatives that break down traditional silo challenges and schools in the institution?
You muted Honora there.
Had to happen, right?
Yeah. So the question is, are we seeing increased kind of interdisciplinary research, transdisciplinary research at our institution? Yeah, so we've seen that. I've seen that at every institution I've worked, right? There's always a big talking point from provosts, right, about that we're going to do cluster hires, we're going to do all these kinds of things, we're going to get the faculty out of their silos, right? But the thing is that administratively, the organization is still built around departments, right? You can have someone who is a dual appointment faculty member, but if you ask the person in the finance office, they'll tell you that they are 51% in agriculture and 49% in environmental engineering, right? Because the money has to come through somewhere, right? The grant money has to know what college it's going to. The publications have to get assigned to some kind of place. I'm not saying that this is the way it should be, right? It is the way it is, though, right? So I think even when we have research that is intended to be interdisciplinary, I think there's still a real advantage to thinking about our jobs from a subject standpoint and from a departmental standpoint. And Honora, I'm happy to hear what you add to that as well.
Yeah, and I agree, but I would also just add, it also kind of makes the case for backing your subject specialty up a level or two, kind of getting out of the weeds and looking more broadly, because, engineering librarians have to do pure science, they have to do applied stuff, they have to do, intellectual property, all sorts of things, right? And so, so it actually, I think, kind of altering the way we think about ourselves and the specific disciplines that we're aligned with, the interdisciplinarity kind of builds the case for that, I think, a little better.
I think you guys are right. It's walking that fine balance.
Mm-hmm.
So our next question, how are specific areas of expertise, such as language skills, handled in this system?
Language, I'm not sure what you mean by that, but
I think language was an example.
Like foreign language, like if you were a librarian for a specific foreign language?
Yes.
So I think it's an interesting question, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest, right, that there are always going to be edge cases when you have members of a team where someone is going to have certain skills that other people won't get to the same kind of level, right? And I think that's okay, right? But I think what you want to do is you want to be intentional about deciding what those are, right? Honora, what do you think?
Yeah, and I think you can manage, as a manager, you can be thinking about the parts of that person's role that cross over, right? And there's certainly going to be shared strategy. And you may be able to build up to a small degree some of those skills within one or another teammate. But it is, there might be, you might never achieve a team where you have balance on something like that, right? But you can work towards it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think, in thinking about language from our kind of standpoint, right, Honora, we have team members that are much stronger programmers than
for us, it's
Honora and I are. Honora and I are not coders. Other members of our team are, right? And that's okay, right? It is okay to have deltas in what people's functional skills are, right? But when you're in a team, you can think about how you're deploying the different skills that you all have kind of collectively.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So kind of building on that, the team structure, the next couple of questions are about that. This person said, I feel like the team model, like the panelists are discussing, places focuses on getting the liaison work done. But what about the functional work?
Well, we think that the functional work gets identified, like the liaisons can create sort of a market for the functional work, right? And so our goal is for us to do the functional work as part of it. It should be part of the service portfolio of liaisons. And that may vary, like, the functional work a STEM liaisons do might be different than the functional work that, business liaisons do. There might be some differences in, for example, statistical analysis software, some of the skill sets. But we believe that that should be built into the liaison's role.
Yeah,
as
I
one
think
of
that's
our
right.
skills.
The functional skills we think are best understood in context, right? I think a lot of times we find that the trouble with doing a pure functional model is you have something like, we'll take from our example, like data management, right? Like data management is universal in the principles, but it's hopelessly idiosyncratic in the implementation, right? I could talk all day about how, someone needs to they just use this README template. It's going to be great. But then when a PI goes to teach their graduate students, that template needs to be so hopelessly customized that that kind of generic sense doesn't really do much. So we think really kind of these functional skills are actually most valuable when they're placed in some context. So I agree. Yeah, we envision the functional roles being done by liaisons.
Right. And then how many librarians are in a team and how many teams are in the library?
Well, there could be, any number. I mean, I think it depends on the library. In our library, we have 4 liaison positions plus my role. So our team, when we're fully staffed, is 5. Right now, we're not fully staffed, so we're 4. But, it just depends how you're organized. You could have teams around like large, subject areas like the humanities. You could have teams based on if you have campus libraries, right? And you could have more than one team. You could have kind of your local team, and then you could be part of a bigger team, right? So I think it would, depend on your institution and how your institution's set up.
All right. And I think we've already answered this. Your group, it really depends if they're team subject based or location based or like library based.
Right. I mean, we happen to be kind of all of those, right? I'm just a big believer that like the work of a librarian is not tied to a location, right? So that it doesn't have to be. So it could be, I think it could just be whatever works. We do have areas of affinity we have a medical team, a health sciences team, right? We could connect with their team and together, be an even bigger team. That's kind of on my list of things I want to see happen.
Great. And then following that, who's on the team? Subject experts, functional experts? Would it be, for example, 3 STEM librarians, or would it be a team of 1 STEM librarian, 1 science, 1 humanities, etc.? Who would be on those teams?
Yeah, so for us, we're all STEM librarians. And again, the functional skills are built in. We are building the functional skills and learning them. If we brought a functional onto the team, then I would expect them to be a librarian, like to and maybe be a little bit of an expert in a certain area, but be spending time teaching us, and they would pick up the library roles. So, I want everybody to be kind of doing the same thing. And there was another part to that question that I've forgotten.
Just an example, is it I think you answered, was it 3 STEM librarians or was it variety of subject areas? So I think you answered that one. And then do you include people from tech services, or is this only public services roles or librarians that are involved in the teams?
Interesting question. We are, focused on public, on the public side, on engagement and support of teaching and research.
And I think we've seen a couple of questions asking about collections work. So collections work is part of this approach too. And I think that's one of the I actually think that's one of the approaches that benefits the most from from going on a team. And, because I think one of the challenges is when you're in these very narrowly defined single subject specialists, like you're the chemistry librarian and you're the chemical engineering librarian, the physics librarian, a lot of times your budget, right, ends up being fairly atomized, right? Like you're looking at very small slivers and it doesn't ever feel like you're making any kind of decisions, right? All you're doing is figuring out how you're going to deal with the next upcoming cereals crunch every time. You're kind of thinking about how much of your monograph budget you're going to lose every single time. But when you do collections work in a team, and I think like for us in STM publishing, we think about this the most, right? It gives you a lot of ability to look at a bigger picture, right? And to get a sense collectively, how are we building our collections? And I think in a lot of ways, this is kind of a reflection of what collection development looks like in 2022, right? Which is that we are not trying to build a collection for the ages necessarily anymore, right? We're trying to build a collection that reflects kind of the current research enterprise priorities and current teaching mission priorities of our institution. And I think the ability to kind of react kind of to data collectively, to make data-driven decisions and to kind of weigh what we're looking at together. I don't know, Honora, from my perspective, that's been a huge advantage of this approach.
Yeah, and I'll share a true confession. When we were in a siloed model, we had 4 librarians, and our collections budget was divided up into 130 different funds, then split across the 4 people. We've folded that up into something like 20 or something, sane, and one person manages it. And they gather the data. They get to look across all the disciplines, right? So they're learning more than just learning, about collections in an area, because they're learning really 21st century collections, right? And so they're looking across all the disciplines. They're looking at all these packages. They gather the data and they bring us together and they say, okay, team, I don't know, we got Elsevier's calling or whatever, right? And we've got to renew something. And here's the data, and we ask questions and we talk about things and we make the decision together, and then they sort of manage that decision and work with our technical services, e-resources people. But one person gets to work with many disciplines. They get to look at all the funds. They get to look at the whole budget, which is, I think, more interesting and more of a learning opportunity. And of course, there's more money, as Alex said, than if it's been, sliced and diced and chopped up fine as it had been. So it's been, I think, a really good experience. And again, a big part of this is the succession planning, right? A big part of this is people knowing the work of the library. And so if you've managed the collection budget, if you do it for a couple of years and you really understand it, then you pass it off to another teammate and they learn it. And so, over time, everybody knows, how to read a license. Everybody knows how to look at data, and so that's been really beneficial for us.
Great. I think, go ahead, Alex.
And likewise, because all of us are taking turns doing this, faculty get the sense that different people can help them, right? And I think, we've talked about this some, but I really want to emphasize that the more sustainable relationship building, I think, is one of the biggest benefits of this, right? When you have kind of the single subject model, faculty aren't building a relationship with the library, they're building a relationship with a single librarian, right? And it's just kind of a one-to-one relationship. And when that librarian leaves the institution or they move to a different role, it's easy to lose that entire relationship, right? And so what is great about rotating the roles is the fact that you actually are creating partnerships between the library as an institution and these faculty. It's much, you're building a web instead of single strands, right?
Right. We have about 3 minutes left. So I have seen several questions about what this looks like for you guys when it comes to annual reviews. If you could kind of touch base on that real quick before we hit the 2 o'clock mark.
Sure. So we have, the 4 librarians have identical job descriptions. And we work together on strategy. So we all have kind of the same big goals, right? But everybody has their part to play in achieving those goals, right? So there's differences between what Alex might do to achieve a goal related to, say, our instruction strategy, or what Josh or Francisco or other librarians might be doing. Each person might be doing different things. So everyone has their personal goals. We do something at Vanderbilt called Feed Forward, which I think is great because it was actually kind of what I was hoping to do anyway. And they implemented it and I said, that's terrific, because what we do is quarterly. We meet quarterly. So we have we come up with goals each quarter, and and usually they're tied again to some bigger goal, right? And we work on them throughout the year. So we sit down once a quarter and review kind of what we were doing and where we need to be, and make adjustments as we need to. So it's the kind of it's the kind of process that I was hoping for anyway. And then, as I said, the university just officially instituted it and gave it a cute name. And I wouldn't have come up with that myself, I'm sure. But so much of what we do is talk to each other, and everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing, right? And so this was just like one final kind of step to make sure everybody knows, everybody's on track, right? But it's not hard to write goals because everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing and what we're working towards. And that, again, it makes it easier to be the manager, to be honest, and to do appraisals.
Well, thank you so much, Honora, excuse me, and Alex and Amber for expert fielding of questions, and our colleague Anna Sandelli too for helping group those in the background. I've seen a couple questions in the chat about whether or not the evaluation link will also be sent out. It will be, and I've been fairly shamelessly dropping Alex and Honora's contact information as well. So this has been such a robust discussion. Thank you so much, Alex and Honora, for a really wonderful presentation. I think it's safe to say you've struck a nerve in the liaison community, given the conversation we're seeing. I'll drop this evaluation a couple more times, but for now, thank you so much to everyone for attending. Alex and Honora, if you want to hang out for just a second, we can talk about next steps, but otherwise, thank you to ACRL, Lois Sharp, as always, for making the magic happen behind the scenes. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Stop the recording.
Thank you, Lois. And Honora and Alex, we can just touch base quickly. Wow, people clear out fast. There are.
We all got hard stops, I guess.
I don't know, right? Run into that next meeting. So we've got, still just so you're aware, I mean, this is probably obvious, but everyone can hear everything we're saying who's still in the room right now. But truly,